I've been living in Japan for 5 months now, and I know it can be quite hard to find an apartment when you're trying to move to Japan, especially as a foreigner. So I thought I would give you a bit of tips, advice, and also share the tricky details when it comes to apartment hunting in Japan, and yeah, hopefully you'll have more information after this video. When it comes to renting an apartment in Japan, I really recommend visiting websites such as Sumo. So Sumo is a very famous apartment hunting website in Japan. It basically has all the apartments posted by different real estate companies, and you'll be able to see basically all of them. Sumo is a Japanese website, so you're not going to be able to have the page in English. However, I really recommend using Google Chrome and automatically translating the web page in English. That works really well. It's what I did personally. I didn't speak that much Japanese when I moved to Japan, and when I was apartment hunting, I just translated the web page automatically in English, and you can do it in whatever language you want, and I was able to get all the information I needed in English rather than Japanese. Of course, some words are going to sound a bit odd, but it usually works quite well, and yeah, it was really easy to use. There are real estate websites, real estate companies that are really specialized in helping foreign people find apartments in Japan, but I don't really recommend them. Usually the prices are much higher for the same amount of space or the same amount of amenities in an apartment, so I really don't recommend it. I would say that overall, speaking Japanese and being able to speak Japanese is quite useful when apartment hunting. However, I feel like you could be able to visit a normal Japanese real estate website and still be able to find an apartment even if you don't speak Japanese, because most of the things you're going to have to do to find an apartment are going to be written. It's going to be through reading the website, sending emails, so you don't actually need to speak Japanese. You can mostly use translators to write and read Japanese. Of course, if you know someone who speaks Japanese, I highly recommend getting their help, but other than that, just use the tools available like Google Translate or DeepL. There's different ways to find an apartment on a Sumo website. First, you can try to find an apartment depending on where you want to live. So for example, you can select a city, an area, a district, or you can also select what train station you're interested in and from which line. In that way, you can really target where you want to live depending on, for example, where you work. If you know that you're going to have to use a certain train line, then you can only target the apartments that are close to that train line. Once you're on a website like Sumo, you'll see that a lot of different companies post the same apartments, and that's completely normal. It's not weird if you're scrolling through the apartments and you realize that it seems like there's the same apartment several times. It's just that for each apartment, different real estate companies are allowed to represent it. Now let's talk about the apartments themselves. Something I really want to address right away is apartments are not very well insulated in Japan, at least compared to where I came from, because I lived in France before. Apartments are really not that well insulated, so that can be a problem when it comes to sound. For example, we have workers building a house right next to our building, and they start work quite early in the morning. Also, the trucks that come and pick our bins, our trash, are quite loud in the morning, so we can hear all of that. And it can also be a problem when it comes to heat, and when it gets cold in the winter, that's going to be an issue. We haven't experienced winter yet, but we have experienced summer. And let me tell you, it's basically the same temperature outside and inside, even if you close the windows. I would really recommend getting an apartment that has shutters, that has blinds, and also apartments where you're able to hang curtains. That will give you that extra layer of insulation that might, help in the summertime and in the wintertime. I was talking about the insulation of windows, but let's actually talk about the windows. Most apartments here in Japan, at least the apartments that we looked at in Osaka and in Sakai, which is where we live now. I don't know how it is in Tokyo, but I'm guessing it's the same. But most apartments didn't have that many windows. I was really shocked at the lack of light in most apartments that we saw on the websites. A lot of the apartments are really long and they usually only have a window at the end or maybe a small window somewhere else, but the lighting isn't that good. And also something you really want to check on the Sumo website is, what do the windows look like? Because I actually realized that a lot of apartments have windows that are blurry. I think it's to improve privacy, because people outside can't see what's going on inside of the apartment because the windows are blurry. But it really isn't that good when the only window you have in your apartment is blurry and you can't actually see the inside when you're inside of the apartment. So one criteria I really had when we were looking at apartments is trying to find an apartment with normal windows that you could actually see through, and also several of them. I really didn't want to be in an apartment where I wasn't going to have any windows, especially because at the beginning I didn't have a job. I still don't have a job, but I knew I was going to spend quite some time in the apartment and I didn't want to be in a really dark and isolated apartment. So it is possible to find an apartment with several windows. We found one with 5 windows, but you might have to really dig, really try and check every single apartment on the websites to find that one apartment that has a few more windows and a lot of lighting. Usually there's a few things that most Japanese apartments have. For example, most apartments have AC. They use AC to cool the apartment in the summer and to heat up the apartment in the winter. In our case, for example, we do have an AC, but we don't have any radiators. So we're going to have to rely on that AC to heat up the apartment in the winter. Most apartments, if not all apartments and houses, have at least one bathtub, because bath culture is very, very important in the Japanese culture. Usually Japanese people have a bath every single night, so you're most likely going to have a bathtub in your apartment. Something else that you're probably going to have is a smart toilet. You're not necessarily going to get one, but at least in our case, it wasn't a criteria. We didn't really necessarily want a smart toilet, but we still ended up having a smart toilet in every single apartment that we toured through video chat. So it is quite common. On the Sumo website, there's a filter mode where you can tick each of the amenities that you're interested in. For example, if you want a smart toilet in your apartment, you click on smart toilet and it will only show the apartments that have smart toilets in them. When it comes to the kitchens, you're most likely not going to have a full-size oven, especially if you're looking at studios or one-bedroom apartments. You're probably not going to have a full-size oven. In Japan, it's quite common to have a mini oven, which is basically a drawer that's under the stove, so in the same place where you would have a normal sized oven, and it's usually used to cook small things, for example to grill fish. And even if you don't have that little small oven, you can also buy a mini grill oven that's basically the size of a microwave, like the one we have here. You can basically use that to cook smaller things like a small pizza, you know, if you want to make bread, you can make a small loaf of bread, things like that. There most likely will not be a washing machine in your apartment. It will not be included. But what you really have to check is that there is that base to actually put a washing machine, because some apartments don't have the base where you can put the washing machine. So even if you did want to buy a washing machine to put in your apartment, you're not going to be able to put it in your apartment if you don't have that special base. So again, you can go on the Sumo website and you can tick that filter. You say that you want the base for the washing machine, and you'll be able to only see the apartments that have that. Usually most apartments are not furnished. It's actually quite hard to find furnished apartments, and that can be quite hard and quite annoying for people who only plan on staying somewhere for 6 months, for example. Again, if you're here with a working holiday visa, you want to stay in Tokyo for 6 months and then move somewhere else in Japan for 6 months, it can be quite annoying to find a furnished apartment. What I will say is it's much cheaper to rent an apartment that's unfurnished and to buy furniture. So of course, if you're not planning on staying here very long, maybe that's not the best option, and that's actually the kind of service that companies specialize in foreign people may be able to provide. There most likely will be more choices available for furnished apartments when it comes to real estate companies specialised in foreign people living in Japan. But if you're planning on staying here more than a few months, I definitely recommend getting an unfurnished apartment and buying your furniture. Buying furniture here isn't that expensive. We personally used IKEA Japan to deliver our furniture, at least the big furniture, for example, our bed, our sofa, our big table and chairs. We used IKEA Japan for that. It was much less expensive than say IKEA France, for example. The prices were cheaper in Japan than in France for the same furniture, for the same objects. When it comes to things like the fridge, the washing machine, maybe you might be able to find some on the internet, or I would recommend going to shops like Joshin, which is where we bought our washing machine and our fridge. And then when it comes to smaller appliances, like for example, we got a rice cooker, our mini oven, we got those from Hard Off, which is a second-hand shop, and those were really cheap. Another option, if you want to get an unfurnished apartment but you don't really want to spend that much money on buying things you're only going to use for 6 months or a year, you can also rent furniture. For example, there's a website called Class where you can basically rent any furniture you want. You can rent, for example, beds, rent mattresses, rent sofas, chairs, a table, a fridge. Sometimes they also have sets of furniture that you can rent all together. For example, a set with one fridge, one washing machine, and one microwave. So it can be quite useful for people who are not planning to stay here very long. In our case, we actually did the math, and it would be more expensive for us to rent those pieces of furniture than to buy them from IKEA, Hard Off and Joshin. But for someone who's planning on living somewhere for 6 months, for example, it would probably be cheaper to rent. Okay, so we also need to talk about the prices of different apartments in Japan. I come from France, and in my case, I really felt like apartments in Japan were cheaper than apartments in France. Definitely cheaper than apartments in Paris, but also cheaper than apartments in other cities in France. In my case, I didn't look at apartments in Tokyo. I only had a look at apartments in Osaka and Sakai. Sakai is in the suburbs of Osaka. Maybe Tokyo is the exception. It is possible that Tokyo apartments are more expensive than other big cities, but I do feel like anywhere else in Japan, apartments are much cheaper than big cities in Europe and big cities in America. A big portion of the price of an apartment is actually dependent on how far the apartment is from the closest train station. Living 3 minutes away or 10 minutes away by foot from the closest train station is actually going to make a huge difference in the price of an apartment. Train culture is very important in Japan. Most people rely on trains to get to work. So usually people really want to be close to train stations, especially because it's quite common for people in Japan to have very long commutes to go to work. So people usually want to get those extra minutes of free time and live as close as possible to the train station. If you don't mind walking an extra 5 minutes to go to the train station, I really recommend looking at apartments that are more than 5 minutes or more than 10 minutes away from a train station. You're going to see a huge difference in the price when it's basically just the house around the corner over there. When we started apartment hunting, my boyfriend really wanted to be close to a train station because we knew that the commute was probably going to be close to an hour. So he wanted to be really close. So first of all, we looked at apartments that were 3 minutes away from the train station. We saw that they were quite expensive or that they didn't really meet our other criteria. And then when we looked at apartments that were more than 10 minutes away from a train station, we saw a huge difference in the price and also in the quality of life. So for example, we were able to find an apartment with more windows, a bigger apartment, maybe an apartment that was more modern, that had all the amenities we wanted. And that's only because we looked at apartments that were 5 minutes further away than the apartments we were looking at before. Now, let's talk about the lease contracts, because I feel like it can be quite tricky when you're a foreigner, and we definitely had a few surprises. First of all, most lease contracts are 2 years. So what that means is if you want to leave after 1 year, but your lease is 2 years, you're still going to have to pay the extra year worth of rents. So we don't want to do that. You can definitely find apartments that have a 1 year lease, but just check on the Sumo website, check in the description of the apartment that the lease is 1 year, not 2 years, because if you're only planning on staying for 1 year, for example, if you're planning on coming for a working holiday visa, you don't want to be paying that extra year of rent. In our case, our lease is 2 years, but the contract said that if we left after 1 year, we wouldn't have to pay that extra year of rent, but we still need to stay at least 1 year. If we left after 6 months, for example, we'd still have to pay 6 months of rent to complete that 1 year. Another really tricky thing, and something you really have to take into account when you're renting in Japan, is the key money. The key money is an amount of money you're going to have to pay at the beginning of your lease. It's not the same thing as a deposit, because when it comes to the key money, you're never going to get that back. It's usually at least, I would say, at least 100,000 yen. Sometimes, for example, in euros, it would range from, 1,000 euros to a couple thousand euros, which can be quite a big amount of money to have to spend when you get to Japan. Not all apartments in Japan will require key money. It's something that was very, very common a few years ago, but nowadays there's more and more apartments that don't require key money anymore. When you're scrolling through the apartments, just check that the key money is an amount of money that you're willing to spend to get that apartment. Symbolically, the key money is an amount of money you pay to thank, I don't know if it's to thank the real estate company or to thank the owner of the building, but basically to thank someone for being able to live in that apartment. In our case, what we did is we did have key money for our apartment, but for each apartment that I was interested in, I took a look at the key money that was required. I divided it by 12 and added that amount to the price of the rent. That way I could have an idea of what the actual rent per month would be. Although I know that the key money is an amount of money you have to pay at the beginning, I just wanted to have an idea of how much it would cost. Or what you can do is just multiply the rent by 12 and add that to the key money, and compare that amount for each apartment you're interested in, because sometimes for an apartment the rent will be cheaper but the key money is much more expensive, and then when you add it up you actually realize that sometimes even an apartment with a rent that is more expensive will actually be worth it because the key money is lower. So just take your time and check the different prices for the key money, for the rent, and try and make your decision knowing that you're going to have to pay that key money at the beginning. On websites like Sumo, usually there's different things you can see when you click on an apartment. First of all, you can see pictures of the apartment, of course. You can see pictures of the building. Usually you can also see pictures of the neighborhood, for example, parks that are nearby. And usually they'll show pictures of the closest convenience stores, the closest konbinis, for example, 7-Eleven, Family Mart. And usually they'll say how close those konbinis are from your apartment. Sometimes they'll also show pictures of the closest shopping centres or closest clothes shop, for example, and usually, if not all the time, there's a picture of the floor plan, of the layout of the apartment. Let's talk about the floor plan, let's talk about the layouts of the apartments. One thing I want you to really check when you're looking at the floor plan of an apartment is to see if the bedroom is a Western style bedroom or a Japanese style bedroom. Western style bedrooms are basically bedrooms you would find anywhere in Europe or in America. It's a normal bedroom where you put a bed, for example. Whereas a Japanese style bedroom is a bedroom with tatami in it. So tatamis are basically traditional mats that are on the floor, and they're quite fragile, they're quite hard to take care of when you're not used to them. So I really wouldn't recommend getting a Japanese style bedroom if you're planning, for example, to put a bed in there. They're not really made to put heavy furniture, things like that. So if you're planning to put a normal bed, you know, with a bed frame and a mattress, just get a Western style bedroom. Usually the names of the rooms will be written in Japanese. Sometimes they might be written in English, but again, if they're written in Japanese, just get your phone out, translate the floor plan with, you know, the picture mode on Google Translate, and you'll be able to see what each room is in English or in whatever language you speak. On the Sumo website, I believe the size of the apartment was written in square meters. However, on the floor plan where you see each room, the size of each room will not be written in square meters. It's probably going to be written in number of tatamis. That doesn't mean that there's actual tatamis in the apartment. It's just the Japanese way of measuring space in an apartment. For reference, one tatami is approximately 1.65 square meters, and it's 17.79 square feet. So what does the whole procedure look like when you're trying to rent an apartment? So again, as I explained before, first of all, you're going to go on the Sumo website, filter the apartments you like according to the train stations you want to be close to, or the areas you want to live in, and of course the amenities you want, or you know, how big you want the apartment to be. When you're scrolling on the Sumo website and you find an apartment that you like, what you can do is there's actually a little button you can click to say that you're interested in the apartment, and then the company will get back to you. Or you can send them an email explaining your situation, explaining that you want to visit the apartment or that you're interested in the apartment. Usually you can do most of it by email, or you can use an app called Line. Line is a very famous app in Japan. It's basically the WhatsApp of Japan. It's what families use to communicate, friends, and also sometimes people use it for work. I personally use it, for example, if I want to contact the closest clinic, I would use Line. So I really highly recommend downloading the Line app if you're planning on moving to Japan, and it could be quite useful when you're apartment hunting, because some of the realtors will answer much quicker if you text them through the Line app. If you don't currently live in Japan and you're apartment hunting to actually move to Japan, I highly recommend sending the company that represents the apartment you're interested in an email explaining your situation. You can explain that you're planning on moving to Japan, you know, explain that you have a job here waiting for you, or that you have a special visa, you know, explain your situation, and ask them if you can video call them to actually visit the apartment with a video chat. That's what we did, and it worked quite well. We actually visited several different apartments, and the Japanese realtors were really professional. A lot of them tried to help us straight away. We had usually the video calls were planned for the next day, so it was really easy, and usually they showed us several apartments and they were really, you know, willing to help us. I highly recommend sending all of your emails and trying to do all of your communication in Japanese. I know it's hard if you don't speak Japanese, but try and use Google Translate or DeepL and send your emails in Japanese. It will really go a long way. I don't recommend sending your emails in English. You really want to blend in and try to speak Japanese as much as possible. Realtors will be more willing to help you if you're making that extra effort of speaking Japanese. And you know, they might be a bit scared if you speak to them only in English, because a lot of Japanese people don't really speak English that well. So if you're making that extra effort of speaking in Japanese with them, sending emails in Japanese, they'll most likely try and help you find an apartment. If you want to plan a video call to visit an apartment, maybe you should send them an email in Japanese explaining your situation and asking them if it's possible to plan a video call to visit an apartment with a realtor that speaks English. That might be possible. In our case, we actually started contacting companies when we were looking at apartments about 10 days before moving to Japan, because our move was quite last minute. We didn't actually know when my boyfriend's job was going to start, so we basically had to find an apartment last minute. And what we quickly realized is apartments go really fast, and especially with the time difference, it was a bit tricky because you would contact a company and then go to bed, but then the next day the apartment you were looking at was actually taken already by the next day. So just beware that apartments come and go really fast. In our case, we actually contacted several different companies for several different apartments at the same time. I don't know if that's what you're actually supposed to do. I don't know if you're supposed to only work with one company or several, but in our case, we actually contacted different companies because we didn't really have that much time to wait for one company to respond. We were really desperate to find an apartment. Once you're interested in an apartment and you know you want to get that one, for example, if you visited it through video chat and you really liked it, you should definitely tell the company that you want that apartment. They're most likely going to send you a form, for example by email, that you're going to have to fill out with different information about you, and you're probably going to have a few documents that you're going to have to send them, for example your passport, your visa. If you have a job waiting for you, you should send them different documents related to your job. Things like that, to prove that you're actually going to live here and that you have a reason for being here, or at least that you have a visa. I'm not quite sure exactly what documents you're supposed to send them. I highly recommend checking that on the internet because I don't want to give out any false information. I can't actually remember all the documents we have to send, but I know we had to send our passport, our visa, and information about my boyfriend's job. What's good is you don't actually need a guarantor for apartments in Japan. If you have one, that's great. In our case, we had my boyfriend's granddad who lives in Japan, who was able to be our guarantor, and we just had to give a little bit of information about him, and I think our real estate company called him to check that he was legit. But if you don't have that, you can just tell the real estate company that you don't have a guarantor, and in that case you're going to have to use a guarantor company. I'm not quite sure how that works, but it's basically just a company that's going to be a guarantor instead of an actual person. I think having a company guarantor does cost a little bit. You might have to pay the company every month, or maybe it's just a fixed sum at the beginning of your lease. I'm not quite sure. I'm pretty sure the guarantor has to be someone that lives in Japan, and it probably also has to be someone with the Japanese nationality. Once you've filled the different forms and you've given the different documents to the real estate company and given proof of a guarantor or a company guarantor, then in that case you're all done, and you'll just have to basically get the keys of your apartment once you're in Japan. And then when you get to Japan, you're basically just going to meet with the real estate agent, and they're just going to make you sign a couple of documents. They're going to make you pay the first month's rent, if not maybe the 2 first months of rent, I can't remember. And they're going to also make you pay the key money and the deposit. Also, there's usually a cleaning fee you're going to have to pay when you get your apartment, but it's not that expensive, I think. And then once you're in your apartment, it's probably going to be unfurnished, and you're going to want to get your furniture. What we did is we looked at the IKEA Japan website a few days before moving to Japan and ordered the furniture we wanted, and it was actually delivered maybe the day we moved into our apartment or the next day. A few things you're going to have to deal with when you have your apartment is dealing with getting electricity, water and TV, but that is actually quite hard to explain now. If you want, I can make a whole other video about that. I'm not even sure about everything that happened because honestly I didn't deal with it myself. My boyfriend and some of our Japanese friends did that together. But if you want a video about that, I can try to help you deal with that. But yeah, just know that it's a whole set of procedures you're going to have to deal with when you move into your apartment. And so yeah, that's all for today's video. I hope by now you have a little bit more information about what it's like to move to Japan, how to find an apartment, what it's like to find your apartment. If you have more questions, don't hesitate to ask them in the comments. I usually answer every single comment, so I really don't mind helping. I can also try and make a second video about the things maybe I missed, or if you have other specific questions. But for now, it's all for today, so I'll see you very, very soon. Bye bye.